Hi, my name is David Warner Matheson, and for over a decade, I've been exploring the evidence which overwhelmingly proves that the world's ancient myths are built on a system of celestial metaphor in which the figures and events described can be shown to relate to specific constellations and regions of the night sky and heavenly cycles. This system of celestial metaphor is worldwide, found in the ancient myths, scriptures, and sacred stories of virtually every culture on every inhabited continent and island of our earth. And it is extremely ancient. It's already operating in the very earliest texts we know of from ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia and ancient India. And this fact suggests that this system came from some even earlier source, which predates all of the most ancient civilizations and cultures known to conventional history. This system of celestial metaphor can be shown to form the foundation for the myths and traditions and sacred stories of cultures from ancient China, ancient Japan, ancient Australia, ancient Africa, and the cultures of the Americas, and the cultures of the Pacific, and the Greek myths, and the Norse myths, on and on around the world, all using the same ancient system. And it can be shown to form the foundation for the figures and episodes described in the scriptures, which we call the Old and New Testaments of the Bible as well. Recently, I had a conversation with my friend and colleague Kamaton regarding the celestial system, and he specifically requested that we discuss evidence of the myths of ancient Egypt being based on celestial metaphor. I had a whole presentation of evidence to present during that discussion, but we got into some other topics and didn't get to all the slides. And so some viewers might get the mistaken impression that we don't really know enough about the myths of ancient Egypt to be able to say whether or not they're built on this same system. During that conversation, Kamaton asks,
what is the connection? What is the timeline, I suppose, whether you can answer this, from sort of the Neolithic era and then moving into Egypt? Do we see sort of really clear links between the star myths of Egypt, but also were there clear star myths? Actually, that's probably my first question.
Yeah.
In Egypt.
At that point, I gave some answers regarding the difficulties facing researchers into the myths of ancient Egypt, including the fact that even after the unlocking of the secrets of the writing system, the forgotten writing system of classical hieroglyphics, scholars, to their great disappointment, did not discover comprehensive narrative texts, similar to texts from other cultures which give complete narrative descriptions of all the various gods and goddesses and their characteristics and adventures and interactions. Instead, what we find are mostly allusions to and references to the gods and goddesses and myths, as if we're already assumed to know them. However, that is not to suggest that we don't have enough evidence to establish that the sacred myths of ancient Egypt are built upon the same system, the same ancient system which underlies the myths and scriptures of other cultures, including the scriptures of the Bible. In fact, we absolutely do have sufficient evidence, more than enough sufficient evidence to establish beyond any reasonable doubt that the myths of ancient Egypt are built upon the same celestial foundation which forms the foundation for the world's sacred myths from other cultures and other continents as well. I explore many examples in my 2019 book entitled The Ancient Worldwide System, Star Myths of the World Volume 1, 2nd edition, which contains an entire chapter on the myths of ancient Egypt, numbering 125 pages and containing over 60 illustrations and star charts in that chapter alone, showing the evidence that the myths of ancient Egypt are celestial in their foundation. We didn't get to look at some examples in this recent conversation, so I'll show them here in this video. In the book, I examine aspects of the different Egyptian creation myths, including those associated with the ancient city of Heliopolis, or On, the city of the sun. This particular set of sacred myths was classified by scholars as the Heliopolitan Theology to distinguish it from other sets of myths and deities associated with other parts of ancient Egypt, including the Memphite theology from the city of Memphis, or the Theban theology associated with the city of Thebes, or Waset, in Upper Egypt, which is actually far to the south of Memphis and On. In my 2019 book, I demonstrate that all of these different theologies can be shown to be using the same system of celestial metaphor, and in fact, to be using the same constellations for their central deities and episodes to a very large degree. In the Heliopolitan theology, the central deity is known as Atum. The ancient texts tell us that in the beginning, a triangular or pyramid-shaped stone, a primordial mound, known as the Benben, arose from the primordial waters. The god Atum settled upon this stone, and from there he created the world. Now, I've often remarked that in general, we're exposed to the myths at a fairly young age, maybe in grade school or middle school or high school, often to the Greek myths, and we're usually given a censored version of the myths because the ancient myths, including the Greek myths, but also the myths of ancient Egypt, are sometimes quite sexually explicit, and even to our modern sensibilities, quite bizarre or shocking. If we later in life pursue the myths further, we might encounter some of the more explicit or difficult to understand aspects of the myths that weren't shown to us when we were younger, and we might be rather shocked or put off or at least puzzled. But I would argue that in almost every case, these aspects of the myths can be traced to the fact that they are based on the constellations and that they're using a system of celestial metaphor to impart profound esoteric truths for our understanding, truths which have direct meaning for our lives and which we need even in the modern day, indeed in the very present moment in which we find ourselves. Now, the ancient Egyptian scriptures inform us that Atum created the world from his own divine completeness, without the need for anyone or anything else. Distinguished scholar and Egyptologist Geraldine Pinch of Oxford, Professor Geraldine Pinch of Oxford, tells us that, quote, the name Atum comes from a word meaning completeness or totality. The potential for all life was contained in Atum, end quote. And so the ancient texts tell us Atum generated the gods without a consort by his own act of self-generation. Pyramid text utterance 527 declares, Atum created by his masturbation in Heliopolis. He put his phallus in his fist to excite desire thereby. The twins were born, Shu and Tefnut. End quote. So Atum generated Shu and Tefnut, and he did so by his own self-generation, which is certainly somewhat shocking or graphic to those unfamiliar with the story. And indeed, it becomes even more potentially shocking when we learn that he appears to have generated Shu and Tefnut by spitting or sneezing them out, which implies that he first generated semen and then took it into his mouth and impregnated himself and then spit out and sneezed out to create Shu and Tefnut. But again, this can be shown to be related to celestial metaphor, as I argue in my 2019 book. And esoterically, it is in fact akin to speaking the universe into existence with pregnant words of power, as we find in other traditions, as Egyptologists have argued. I didn't originate that parallel. It's just much more graphic and explicit than we're perhaps used to hearing. Now, it was the gods Shu, god of air, and Tefnut, goddess of mist and moisture, who came together in the first sexual act of intercourse between male and female, and who by that act generated the next generation of gods, the goddess Nut of the sky and Geb of the earth. Here's a famous illustration of Nut and Geb. The sky goddess Nut is arching over the heavens, her feet in the east, note the upraised heels, and her fingertips going down into the west. Below her, stretched out upon the earth, is the god Geb, in a distinctive posture that also has its origins in the stars of a specific constellation, as I'll argue in a moment. The ancient texts tell us that Nut and Geb embraced each other so tightly that there was no room for any life between them. And so their father, Shu, god of the air, had to separate them. And that is what we see illustrated in this famous scene, which is repeated in many other surviving examples from ancient Egypt. Shu is separating Nut and Geb in order to give some breathing room and enable life to proceed, to continue to go through the generations. The sexual union of Geb and Nut produced the next generation of gods and goddesses, specifically the god Osiris, the goddess Isis, the god Set, and the goddess Nephthys. And so note that we have a total of 9 gods and goddesses in this mythology. First, Atum, then his offspring, Shu and Tefnut, then their children, Geb and Nut, and then their 4 children, the gods Osiris, Isis, Set, and Nephthys. So 5 plus 4 more, making 9. So that group of deities is also referred to as the Ennead, a word which means the 9. Now, if you're familiar with my work, or if you read through the analysis presented in my recent books, such as The Ancient Worldwide System from 2019 or Myth and Trauma from 2020, you might be able to guess already what constellation I believe represents the sacred Benben stone arising from the primordial waters, the sacred mound upon which the highest god, Atum, settles in order to begin his act of creation. That's right. It is none other than the constellation Ophiuchus, a constellation of tremendous mythological importance and a constellation with a distinctive obelisk shape to its central body, which is associated with a sacred mountain in many of the world's ancient myths, and which has a pyramid-shaped or pyramidion-shaped triangle at the top of that central obelisk body. And above this triangular stone, atop Ophiuchus, we see the constellation Hercules, a constellation which plays the role of the most powerful deity in many of the world's myths, as I demonstrate with abundant evidence in my books and videos, and as I discuss in the Ancient Worldwide System. The story of Atum generating the next generation of deities out of his own completeness can in fact be seen in the stars of the night sky. By changing just one line of the outline of the constellation, we can see a whole different aspect of the constellation with which Atum is associated. You see how that changes everything? And the ancients clearly saw this, as we can see evidence of this from myths from various cultures, including this myth this sacred creation story from ancient Egypt. And I won't draw it here, but we could easily change yet another single line of his lower downward reaching arm in order to envision him performing the act that's described of putting his phallus in his fist that we find described in Utterance 527 from the pyramid texts. The act of spitting Shu and Tefnut and sneezing from his mouth can also be seen from this very same outline. That arm that's coming down proceeds out of his head. It looks like that arm is coming right out of his head. And in fact, in other myth systems, we see, for example, the goddess Athena springing from the head of Zeus. And Athena is associated beyond any doubt with the constellation Ophiuchus, down here below Hercules, and Zeus, her father, is associated with Hercules. So Athena proceeds out of the head of Zeus. She's descended from the head of Zeus, just as Shu, who can be shown, as we'll see in a moment, to be associated with Ophiuchus, proceeds out of the head of Atum. Down below Ophiuchus, we see the constellation Scorpio, stretched out in a way that's very distinctive and notable, and we'll return to that in a moment. I just wanted to show the outline here. So now, here's a piece of artwork showing the god Amun-Ra. In my 2019 book, I demonstrate that Amun, or Amun, he's from the Theban creation story, the Theban theology, but I argue and demonstrate that he's associated with that very same constellation Hercules with which Atum is associated. And note the very graphic depiction in this artwork, this ancient artwork showing Amun, showing the phallus, corresponding to the constellation Hercules, as we've seen, but also note the upraised arm of the god, which corresponds to the upraised arm or weapon seen in the constellation of Hercules, as well as the square-shaped headgear worn by the god in this artwork, which is evocative or reminiscent of the square-shaped head of the outline of the constellation Hercules in the night sky. Now let's take a look at the next generation of gods and goddesses. Shu and Tefnut come together and produce the divine goddess Nut of the sky and Geb of the earth. Then Shu, the god of air, must separate Nut and Geb with his upraised arms. And as I show in my 2019 book, this famous episode is undoubtedly based on the stars of the night sky, and indeed the same mythologically important region of the night sky that we've been examining. This particular illustration that I'm showing here is found in the beautiful papyrus of the princess Nesetaneb-Tashru, the daughter of an important high priest who basically ruled over Upper Egypt, that is southern Egypt, during the 22nd or the 21st dynasty or dynasty. That papyrus was buried with Nesetaneb-Tashru in about the year 940 BC or BCE. Now, let's take a look at the region of the sky that we've been examining. I'll show it here adjacent to the papyrus showing the gods and goddesses. And I'll show the stars with the colors inverted for greater ease of seeing the stars and the constellations and the outlines, so that the dark of the night sky will now be inverted and be light, and the bright stars in the Milky Way will be dark. So let's connect the outlines of the constellations, Hercules, and then Ophiuchus below Hercules, and Scorpio below Ophiuchus. Can you detect the correspondence, the association between the three principal figures in the story about Shu separating Nut above and Geb below to the constellations? Ophiuchus can clearly be seen to be a figure with arms upraised. Nut, overarching above Ophiuchus, is easy to match up with the constellation Hercules, especially if we remove a few features in order to leave just the rear foot with the heels upraised and the downward reaching arm with extended fingertips. You see how that matches? And so below Nut, separating her from Geb, we see Shu in the figure of Ophiuchus with arms upraised. And then down below Ophiuchus, down below Shu, we see Geb separated from Nut by the intervening figure of the god Shu, the god of the air, with his arms upraised. Geb is quite clearly corresponding to the shape and position of the constellation Scorpio beneath Ophiuchus. So there are many, many more examples which could be shown, especially from the famous myth series surrounding Isis and Osiris and their son Horus and the conflict with Set and the descent of Osiris into the underworld, which is explored in my 2019 book. But I trust that this brief overview will establish beyond doubt that the myths of ancient Egypt are celestial in their foundation, and that they're using the very same system of celestial metaphor which underlies the world's other ancient myths and sacred stories, including those found in the Bible. So what does this mean? Well, the implications are enormous and could fill many, many more videos. For one thing, this evidence overturns the conventional paradigm of ancient human history because it shows a commonality between the myths of cultures around the globe, including the most ancient cultures known to history, but also cultures on distant continents like the Americas or even the islands of the Pacific, on the complete other side of the world from ancient Egypt or ancient Greece. And it suggests that they are all inheritors of a system originating in an even more ancient culture, even more ancient than ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia and ancient India and ancient China. A culture that's no longer known to us, a forgotten culture, one perhaps as ancient to the men and women of ancient Egypt as the culture of ancient Egypt is to us, or even older than that, even more ancient to the Egyptians than the Egyptians are to us. It also shows that we are, in fact, around the globe, all connected in some profound way, even though the religions that have been built on these ancient stories, and especially the religions which take those stories literally, such as literalist Christianity, seek to divide people from one another, arguing, in the case of literalist Christianity, that their stories are literally true and everyone else's traditions and myths are false, when in fact it can be shown that the stories and characters in the Bible are based on the very same system of celestial metaphor which underlies the myths of ancient Egypt and of ancient Greece and of ancient India and of ancient Mesopotamia and of ancient China and of ancient Japan and the myths of the Norse and of Africa and of Australia and of the Americas and of the cultures of the Pacific and other cultures around the globe. And as I explain in my most recent book, Myth and Trauma, it means that these myths are not literal, but rather that they are esoteric and metaphorical, designed to impart truths to us which we need and which have as one of their central themes the recovery of our own self, from whom we become alienated in this life and which is buried and suppressed and forgotten, just as Osiris in the myths of ancient Egypt is buried and has to be searched for, or just as Inanna in the myths of ancient Mesopotamia goes down into the underworld. I hope that this explanation is helpful to you in some way. You can find much more information at my website, Star Myths of the World, at starmythsworld.com. Thank you for watching, and please share as appropriate with those for whom this message would be positive and helpful, and especially with Egyptologists, if you have any among your friends and family.